For machine learning deployment, I would be using AWS infrastructure. And within AWS infrastructure, I would be mainly taking help of Amazon API Gateway, AWS Lambda, and Amazon S3. AWS Lambda provide a serverless computing infrastructure which will help us to only focus on the business logic, and all the underlying infrastructure required to run our business logic would be handled by AWS Lambda. So the AWS Lambda will automatically scale up and down based on customer load, and user will only pay for the amount of time spent on execution of our business logic. So that's the benefit of using AWS Lambda. All the operational complexity would be managed by Amazon. It would be hidden to user. The other component which I would be using is Amazon API Gateway. The Amazon API Gateway will provide an API endpoint which we can share with client, right? And the client could be anyone. It could be the mobile user, or it could be web browser, or it could be any other application which would be interacting with our ML API, right? So that's the purpose of Amazon API Gateway. It will provide an endpoint, and all the API management would be handled by API Gateway itself. It's a managed service provided by Amazon. The third component, which is Amazon S3, where we have stored all the model artifacts, and our Flask app will access those model artifacts and will perform required operation within the Flask app, mainly around prediction. So that's the overall flow, right? So in real world, the client will interact with API Gateway. API Gateway will take input and will convert it to Amazon Lambda format. Amazon Lambda will take that input. It will parse the HTTP request received by Amazon API Gateway, and it hand it over to Flask app. And Flask app will perform all the ML operation, will generate prediction, send it back to Lambda function, and Lambda function will send response back to API Gateway, and API Gateway will return response back to client. Right, so that's the overall flow. So Zappa makes it very easy to deploy any serverless deployment, which means any deployment based on AWS Lambda. It makes it very easy for any user to deploy any application. So as a data scientist, what we need to do in order to launch our ML API within the AWS infrastructure, we only need to provide Flask app. So Flask app will implement all the logic required for implementing our machine learning API. And in addition to that, we also need to provide some deployment setting for AWS so that Zappa will know where to deploy, how to deploy, right? So all those of settings and configuration, data scientists will pass it to Zappa. Zappa will take those as an input. It will package everything within a tar file. It will send it to AWS, and it will launch all the underlying infrastructure required to launch our ML API. So Zappa will launch Amazon API Gateway. It will launch AWS Lambda. It will create a Lambda function. It will create a Lambda function handler, right? Because Lambda function handler is an interface between API Gateway and our Flask app. So Lambda function handler will take input from API Gateway. It will pass that request, It will convert the message into the Flask app compatible format. It will send the request to Flask. Flask will consume that message. It will perform different operations required for generating prediction. It will send a response back to Lambda function. Lambda function will convert it to appropriate format required for API gateway. It will send a response back to API gateway, and then API gateway will send it back to mobile client or any client, right? So all these functionality would be done by Zappa, right? And that's the benefit of using Zappa as an automation tool for launching all the AWS infrastructure. That's make our life much more easy. So Zappa not only helps in terms of deploying our changes, it will also help us in updating our changes, right? Because we normally need to update our changes to deploy new changes in production. So Jepa make it very easy to deploy or update any changes in the production. It will also allow us to roll back any changes to a particular version, right? If something goes wrong, we can very easily roll back our changes. And Jepa will also help you in finding out relevant logs, right? If something goes wrong with our ML API, we need to look for the logs, right? So Jepa will make it very easy to pull all those logs from AWS infrastructure, and it will present that log in a very user-friendly manner to data scientists. And data scientists can look into those logs, debug the problem, and then fix it, right? So that's from the overall architecture and planning perspective, and we will see each and every aspects in our demo, right? And definitely Japa makes it very easy to deploy all the changes, but as a user, we always need to understand what's going behind the scene, means what resources AWS is creating, right? How integration is happening, right? Because that will help us in terms of understanding how my overall end-to-end architecture is behaving. And in terms of debugging, that will make our life much more easy. So definitely we don't need to create all those resources manually, but we need to understand what's going on with those resources and how it's interacting with all the other components. And we'll see each and every aspect in our demo.